It was a quiet evening in the small, forgotten town nestled deep in the mountains, the kind of place where the air felt heavier with history and the stars seemed brighter against the inky blackness of the sky. The streets were deserted, save for the faint flicker of a porch light here and there, and the occasional creak of a rocking chair swaying in the wind. In the middle of it all stood a house, weathered and unassuming, much like its owner. He was a man who didn't attract much attention. Wrinkled hands scarred from decades of work, silver hair barely clinging to his scalp, and a gaze so sharp it could cut through stone. He was the kind of man people either ignored or stayed away from, a relic of another time. At 65, most would have written him off as just another old-timer who lived alone, minding his own business. But there was something about him, something that people couldn't quite put their finger on, a quiet intensity that hinted at stories untold. That night, as he sat on his porch with a steaming cup of tea, the world shifted. The stars above seemed to ripple, their position subtly distorting as though someone had stirred the heavens like a pool of water. He noticed it first not with fear but with curiosity. A sharp flash of light lit up the sky, followed by a deep rumble that shook the earth beneath his feet. The ground trembled, and distant sounds of something unnatural pierced the air, but he didn't flinch. Instead, a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. The rest of the town was thrown into chaos. Windows slammed shut, dogs barked frantically, and people peeked out from behind curtains with wide, terrified eyes. The noise grew louder, like the growl of some otherworldly engine descending upon them. And then they appeared. The sky was no longer the serene expanse it had been moments ago. A swarm of alien crafts, sleek and gleaming, descended like vultures circling their prey. The crafts emitted an eerie hum, the kind that resonated deep in your chest, unsettling and inescapable. The townsfolk panicked, running in every direction, their screams swallowed by the alien hum. Bright beams of light shot down from the crafts, illuminating the streets like searchlights. The air grew thick with tension, the kind that made every second stretch into eternity. Yet, through all of it, the old man remained seated on his porch, watching the chaos unfold with a calmness that bordered on eerie. Suddenly, one of the crafts broke away from the swarm, hovering directly above his house. A beam of light shot down, and from it emerged a group of creatures unlike anything seen on Earth. They were tall, their skin glistening with a metallic sheen, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural, cold light. Their movements were precise, calculated, as though they had done this 1,000 times before. They didn't speak, but their intent was clear. They were here for him. The townsfolk, those brave enough to watch from their windows, gasped in horror. What could one old man possibly do against such a force? The aliens advanced, their steps echoing unnaturally in the silence. But the old man didn't move. He took one last sip of his tea, set the cup down with deliberate care, and rose to his feet. The creatures stopped, perhaps sensing something they hadn't anticipated. The old man cracked his neck, rolled his shoulders, and for the first time, truly smiled. It wasn't a smile of fear or submission, it was a smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment, someone who knew something the rest of the world didn't. The air seemed to shift around him, the tension thickening as the aliens drew their weapons, sleek, glowing devices that hummed with lethal energy. The townsfolk held their breath, certain they were about to witness the end of a man who had no chance of survival. But what happened next defied every expectation. The old man moved. Not with the slow, creaking movements of someone his age, but with a speed and precision that blurred the line between human and something more. Before the first alien could react, he was already upon them. A flash of motion, a crackling sound, and one of the creatures lay on the ground, its weapon now in the old man's hand. He turned to face the others, his expression one of grim determination. The creatures hesitated, their cold eyes flickering with something that looked almost like fear. The old man didn't give them time to recover. He launched himself into the fray, his movements a perfect blend of grace and brutality. The weapon in his hand was no longer alien, it was his, an extension of his will, used with the skill of someone who had fought countless battles. The townsfolk couldn't believe their eyes. The man they had dismissed as just another old-timer was dismantling the alien threat with an ease that defied logic. Yet, even as the last alien fell, the crafts above remained, their lights growing brighter, their hum intensifying. The old man looked up at the sky, his smile fading into a look of resolve. "So, you want to do this the hard way," he muttered under his breath. The crafts began to descend, their massive forms casting long shadows over the town. Whatever was coming next, it was bigger, deadlier, and unlike anything the town or the world had ever faced. And yet, the old man stood firm, his figure illuminated by the glow of the descending crafts. The question lingered in the air, unspoken, but deafening: who was he really, and how could he possibly stand against what was coming? The crafts hovered lower, their size now fully apparent. They were massive, impossibly sleek, and utterly silent except for the deep, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The lights from their undersides bathed the town in an unnatural glow, making the surrounding houses look ghostly and distorted. The old man didn't budge, his posture still relaxed, but his eyes were locked on the ships with a sharp intensity. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he looked like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, as if this confrontation was inevitable. The aliens that had fallen at his hands lay scattered around him, their strange weapons and bodies eerily still. The faintly metallic scent of their blood, if it was even blood, hung in the air, mixing with the crisp scent of the mountain night. The townsfolk, those still brave enough to watch, remained glued to their windows. Some whispered frantic prayers, while others simply stared, their minds racing to make sense of what they were witnessing. How could one man, an old man, at that fight creatures like this? And why him? Why his house? The crafts continued their descent until they were close enough to dwarf the entire block. Their smooth exteriors rippled with light, like liquid metal under a moonlit sky. Then, with a sudden, synchronized motion, smaller pods detached from the undersides of the ships, landing with heavy thuds that shook the ground. From the pods emerged more aliens larger than the first group, their armor thicker, their weapons more advanced. These ones moved differently, with a confidence that spoke of higher rank and greater skill. They spread out in a wide formation, encircling the old man. Still, he didn't move. His eyes darted from one alien to the next, studying them, calculating. A faint smirk played on his lips again. It wasn't arrogance, it was the look of someone who had been through worse. But the tension in the air was thick, and even he couldn't ignore the odds stacking up against him. For a brief moment, time seemed to pause. The aliens stood still, their weapons raised, but not firing. It was as if they were waiting for something or someone. Then came the voice. It wasn't a sound anyone could hear with their ears, it was a presence, a whisper in the back of the mind, cold and commanding. It spoke not in words, but in emotion's power, dominance, and an overwhelming sense of inevitability. The old man's expression darkened. "I figured you'd show up eventually," he muttered, his voice low but steady. He wasn't speaking to the aliens in front of him. He was speaking to something far greater, something unseen. The lights on the crafts above began to pulse rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the very bones of anyone nearby. The townsfolk, still hiding in their homes, clutched at their ears, their faces contorted in pain. Some began to cry, overwhelmed by the oppressive energy emanating from the ships. But the old man stood firm, unmoved. And then it happened. A beam of light, brighter than anything yet, shot down from the largest craft. It wasn't a weapon, it was something else, something that made the air around it shimmer and twist. From the light emerged a figure. It was taller than the others, its form more refined, almost regal. Its armor was sleek and black, reflecting the light like polished obsidian. Its eyes burned with an intensity that made the others look dull in comparison. This was no soldier. This was a commander, or perhaps something even more significant. The old man's jaw tightened as the figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. It stopped just a few feet from him, towering over him, its presence almost suffocating. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. Then, without warning, it raised a hand. The air around the old man seemed to ripple, and suddenly he was lifted off the ground, his feet dangling several inches above the dirt. The townsfolk gasped in horror. It was as if an invisible force had wrapped itself around him, holding him in place. But even as he hung there, seemingly helpless, his expression didn't change. If anything, he looked annoyed. "Is this how you greet an old friend?" he said, his voice strained but laced with defiance. The figure tilted its head again, as though the words intrigued it. For a brief moment, the grip on him loosened, and he dropped back to the ground, landing on his feet with surprising grace. The figure finally spoke, not in the way humans speak, but directly into the minds of everyone within range. Its voice was cold, mechanical, yet deeply commanding. "You are not who you appear to be." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. The old man crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "And you're not as clever as you think," he shot back. "If you were, you'd have known better than to come here." The tension in the air crackled like a live wire. The aliens surrounding them shifted uneasily, their weapons still trained on the old man but not firing. It was clear they were waiting for some kind of signal. The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, and it stepped closer, the ground seeming to tremble with each step. "You have something that belongs to us," the voice pressed on, its tone colder now. "Surrender it, and your end will be swift." The old man's smirk returned. "That's the thing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What you're looking for doesn't belong to you. And if you think you can take it..." He trailed off, his eyes locking onto the figure with a fire that hadn't been there before. "You're welcome to try." The figure raised its hand again, and this time the hum from the crafts above grew deafening. The air itself seemed to vibrate, and the light around the old man distorted, bending and warping as though reality itself was being rewritten. The townsfolk screamed, some collapsing under the weight of the oppressive energy. But the old man didn't falter. His hands clenched into fists, and for a brief moment, the glow around him seemed to flicker. And then it stopped. The hum ceased, the light dimmed, and the figure lowered its hand. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The figure took a step back, as if reassessing the situation. "You've hidden well," it said, its voice colder than ever. "But you cannot hide forever." The old man's smirk widened into a grin. "I wasn't hiding," he replied. "I was waiting." Before anyone could react, the old man moved again. It was faster this time, almost too fast to see. One moment he was standing in front of the figure, and the next he was behind it, holding one of the alien weapons he had taken earlier. The figure froze, its glowing eyes narrowing in what could only be described as surprise. But the old man didn't fire. He didn't need to. The weapon hummed in his hands, its glow growing brighter with each passing second. The air around them grew heavy again, but this time it wasn't coming from the crafts, it was coming from him. The figure turned its head slightly, as though trying to understand what was happening. But before it could act, the old man spoke again, his voice low and filled with a quiet, unshakable confidence. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said. "But you will." And then, with a sudden burst of light, everything changed. The burst of light radiated outward, engulfing everything in its path with an intensity that left the air crackling. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The townsfolk shielded their eyes, their windows vibrating from the force of the blast. The alien crafts above shuddered, their sleek forms flickering as if disrupted by some invisible force. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light disappeared, leaving only silence in its wake. When the townsfolk dared to look again, the scene in the street had shifted. The old man was still standing, his back straight, his eyes sharper than ever. The alien weapon he had held was now disintegrating in his hands, crumbling into ash as though it had been drained of all its energy. The figure in black, the one who had radiated such power, was no longer towering over him. It had taken a step back, its head tilted as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. But there was something else now, something different. The old man wasn't alone. From the shadows of the surrounding houses, figures began to emerge. At first, they were hard to make out, their forms blending into the dark like phantoms. But as they stepped into the eerie glow of the craft's lights, their features became clearer. They were human, or at least, they appeared to be. Men and women of various ages, dressed in ordinary clothes, their faces calm but their eyes fierce. Each of them held an air of quiet strength, as if they had been waiting for this moment just as much as the old man had. The black armored figure turned its head, scanning the newcomers with its glowing eyes. The tension in the air thickened, the kind that made your skin prickle and your breath hitch. The townsfolk, still watching from their windows, could hardly believe what they were seeing. These strangers had come out of nowhere, but they moved with purpose, surrounding the old man in a protective formation. "You've been hiding them," the figure said, its voice echoing in the minds of everyone nearby. There was no anger in its tone, only cold calculation. "You've built an army." The old man's grin returned, but this time it carried a sharper edge. "Not hiding," he said, his voice calm yet cutting. "Training. Preparing." The black armored figure's head tilted slightly, as though considering this new information. Then, with a sharp, almost mechanical movement, it raised its hand again. The crafts above responded instantly, their lights intensifying as beams of energy began to charge. The hum returned, louder than ever, vibrating through the ground and rattling the very foundations of the town. The strangers surrounding the old man didn't flinch. Instead, they moved in perfect synchronization, each of them raising their hands toward the crafts. And that's when it happened, the second twist, the one that no one, not even the black armored figure, had seen coming. The strangers weren't just ordinary humans. As their hands extended toward the crafts, the air around them began to ripple, shimmering like heat waves on asphalt. Strange symbols, glowing faintly, appeared on their skin, spreading like veins of light. The crafts above faltered, their hum stuttering as if something unseen was interfering with their systems. The strangers were fighting back not with weapons, but with something far older, far more powerful. The old man's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You thought Earth would be easy to conquer," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You thought we were weak. But you forgot one thing." The black armored figure didn't respond. Its glowing eyes were locked on the strangers, its posture rigid. It wasn't fear, it was something more dangerous. It was realization. The old man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the figure. "We've been here before," he said. "And we'll be here long after you're gone." The ground beneath them trembled again, but this time it wasn't from the crafts. It was coming from the earth itself. Cracks began to spiderweb across the street, faintly glowing with the same strange light that emanated from the strangers. The air grew heavy, charged with a power that felt ancient and unyielding. The town wasn't just a battleground, it was becoming something else entirely, something alive. And then, for the first time, the black armored figure spoke directly to the old man, its tone sharper, more focused. "You're not one of them," it said. "You don't belong here." The old man's grin faded, replaced by a look of grim determination. "No," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I'm here all the same." The crafts above began to shift, their lights dimming and their forms flickering. Whatever the strangers were doing, it was working. But it wasn't enough. The largest craft, the one from which the black armored figure had emerged, remained steady. Its lights pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat, each pulse stronger than the last. The figure raised its hand again, and this time the pulse of light wasn't directed at the old man or the strangers, it was aimed at the town itself. The streets, the houses, the very ground they stood on began to glow with an unnatural energy. The townsfolk screamed, their homes trembling as if they were about to be torn apart. The old man's eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of concern crossed his face. "You're willing to destroy everything just to win?" he said, his voice rising. The figure's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "Winning is the only goal." And with that, the light from the largest craft intensified, swallowing the town in a blinding glow. The last thing anyone saw before the light consumed them was the old man, standing firm, his fists clenched and his eyes blazing with defiance. And then, silence. The townsfolk emerged slowly, their faces pale with shock. The strangers stood in the middle of the street, their glowing symbols fading until they were nothing more than faint scars. They looked at each other, then at the place where the old man had stood. The ground was scorched, the patterns burned into the earth like a mark that would never fade. One of the townsfolk, an older woman with tears streaming down her face, stepped forward. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice trembling. The stranger who had spoken earlier shook their head. "He gave everything," they said quietly. "For all of us." But just as the tension began to ease, as the first rays of dawn broke through the haze, a faint hum echoed in the distance. The strangers tensed, their eyes scanning the horizon. And then they saw it, a shadow moving against the light of the rising sun, growing larger with each passing moment. The shadow on the horizon grew larger, cutting through the early morning light like a storm cloud rolling in. The faint hum grew louder, unmistakable now, a sound that sent chills down the spines of everyone watching. The strangers immediately regrouped, their movements sharp and purposeful, though the exhaustion on their faces was clear. The townsfolk, still frozen in shock, began murmuring among themselves, fear creeping back into their voices. One of the strangers turned toward the crowd. "Get back inside!" they yelled. "Whatever this is, you don't want to be out here." The townsfolk hesitated, their feet rooted to the ground. They had just seen an unimaginable battle unfold before their eyes, watched their homes spared by forces they couldn't comprehend. But the urgency in the stranger's voice snapped them out of their daze. Slowly, they retreated back into their houses, peeking cautiously from their windows once more. The shadow finally took form, revealing another ship, larger than any they had seen before. Its surface gleamed in the sunlight, a metallic black that seemed to absorb every beam of light that touched it. Unlike the earlier crafts, this one moved with an eerie silence, its hum now an undercurrent so low it felt like a vibration in the chest rather than a sound in the air. It stopped just above the town, hovering as if observing. The strangers stood their ground, their eyes locked on the massive vessel. One of them, the one who had spoken earlier, clenched their fists, their glowing symbols faintly reappearing on their skin. "We're not done yet," they muttered under their breath. But before anyone could act, a beam of light shot down from the ship, hitting the ground a few feet in front of the strangers. They braced themselves, expecting another attack, but instead, a figure began to materialize within the beam. It was humanoid, but taller, its features sharp and angular, its body wrapped in a shimmering, translucent armor. The air around it seemed to warp slightly, as though reality itself bent in its presence. The figure stepped forward, its movements graceful and deliberate. It looked at the strangers, then at the scorched ground where the old man had stood. When it finally spoke, its voice was deep and resonant, carrying an authority that demanded attention. "Where is he?" The strangers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. The leader of the group stepped forward cautiously. "If you mean the old man," they said, their voice steady but wary, "he's gone. He gave everything to stop your kind." The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "He's not gone," it said. "Not yet." The strangers tensed at the cryptic words, their instincts telling them to prepare for the worst. But the figure didn't move to attack. Instead, it knelt down, placing a hand on the scorched ground. The light from its armor dimmed slightly, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the earth beneath the figure's hand began to glow faintly. The patterns burned into the ground, pulsed once more, their energy flickering weakly. The strangers watched in stunned silence as the glow intensified, spreading outward like ripples in water. And then, impossibly, the old man's voice echoed faintly through the air. Still holding on, the voice said, strained but defiant. "You don't give up, do you?" The figure stood, its gaze fixed on the glowing patterns. "You're stronger than I expected," it said. "But strength alone won't save you. The old man's voice grew louder, more focused. "I wasn't trying to save myself," he said. "I was trying to save them." The figure's head turned slightly, its gaze shifting toward the strangers and the distant townsfolk. "A noble sentiment," it said. "But ultimately futile. They'll never be ready for what's coming." The stranger who had spoken earlier stepped forward, anger flashing in their eyes. "We'll see about that," they said. "You underestimate us, just like the others did." The figure's expression remained unreadable, but there was a pause, a moment of consideration. "Perhaps," it said. "But even if you survive today, there's more to come. This is just the beginning." The old man's voice cut through again, sharp and determined. "Then we'll face it. Together." The glowing patterns flared brightly one last time, and with a sound like a distant thunderclap, the energy dissipated completely. The figure looked down at the ground, then back at the strangers. "He's gone now," it said simply. "But his actions have bought you time. Use it wisely." Without another word, the figure stepped back into the beam of light, its form dissolving into shimmering particles. The massive ship above began to move, ascending higher and higher until it vanished into the sky, leaving only the faint hum of its engines behind. The strangers stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. Finally, one of them spoke, their voice quiet but resolute. "He gave us a chance," they said. "We can't waste it." The townsfolk began to emerge cautiously from their homes, their faces a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They approached the strangers hesitantly, their gratitude clear, but their questions unspoken. One of the older men stepped forward, his voice trembling as he addressed the group. "What do we do now?" The leader of the strangers looked at him, their expression thoughtful. "You live," they said. "You rebuild. And you prepare. Because this isn't over." The townsfolk nodded slowly, their determination growing as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. They didn't fully understand the battle they had witnessed or the sacrifices that had been made, but they knew one thing for certain: they were still here. And as long as they were, they would fight to protect what they had. The strangers began to move, preparing to leave. One of the younger townsfolk, a boy no older than 16, stepped forward, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Will we ever see you again?" he asked. The leader paused, their gaze softening slightly. "Maybe," they said. "But if we don't, remember what you saw today. Remember that even when things seem impossible, there's always a way to fight back." With that, the strangers disappeared into the forest, their forms blending into the shadows as if they had never been there. The townsfolk watched them go, their hearts heavy but their spirits unbroken. They turned back to their homes, their steps purposeful, their minds already thinking of how to rebuild. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the town that had withstood so much, a faint hum echoed in the distance. It was different this time, softer, almost comforting. The townsfolk paused, looking toward the horizon, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they smiled. The fight wasn't over. But for now, they had hope. And that was enough.